the most nervous I ever was my entire life. I'm 18 years old. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm trudging across the college campus for the very first time in my life. I'm going to my very first college class. It's Graphic Design 101. So on one hand, I've got like this case with all of these brand new art supplies. They give us this whole list of things to buy. And as like a poor high school kid, I only had like the cheap pencils and stuff that I was drawing with. And now I have like new pens and pencils and all these cool things. And on the other hand, I've got this giant portfolio case filled with all of this paper that they told us to get, so I've got all this great stuff. And it was so big that I had to kind of hold it like this when I walked across campus. And I'm this scrawny little 18-year-old dude, so like my arm is killing me as I'm walking across. So I get into the classroom, find out where I'm supposed to go. Everybody else is kind of in the same boat. We're all freshmen, we're all figuring this out together. We're sitting down, we're kind of figuring this out. And in the back of the room, the wall was just a giant white wall that spread across the length of the entire room. And there were just all these like thumbtacks all over. They weren't in any particular order. They were just thumbtacks in the wall. So as the class is getting ready to start, the teacher, strolls in. She's got like something under her arm, like a poster, and she just walks through the crowd of students right to that like back wall, that white wall in the back, and she takes this poster and she thumbtacks it up to that wall. And she turns to us and says, "This is your very first project. This is the project you're going to be working on today in class. So take out your stuff and let's get going." And on this poster, there are just all these words written. And I'd seen most of them before. I just hadn't seen them arranged in that way, and I couldn't figure out, what does this have to do with design? Aren't we supposed to be making things look cool? Like, why are we writing down these words? And so I still have that very poster. There it is. I still had it in that portfolio case that I was carrying across campus. I had this poster in there, so I went, took it out, snapped a photo of it, and I still have it today. And what I love about it is that this is what was guiding us throughout our entire semester. These were the design principles that we were going to be applying to our work to make our work better. And what would happen is every morning we'd roll into class, and whatever we had worked on the night before, we'd go to that big white wall, we'd tack it up, and we'd have a design critique. So students would stand around, I'd explain, hey, this is why I did this is what I'm going for here, and then other students would say, well, try this. But whenever something wasn't working, like if a design just wasn't clicking and we couldn't figure it out, the teacher would point at her poster that she hung up at the beginning of every class and say, which one of these design principles can you apply to your work right now to make it better? And that stuck with me because I was, in high school, I was a good drawer. I was like the artsy kid, and I drew Batman all the time. I was really good at it. But what I found out is all the kids in all the schools like in the area that were really good at drawing Batman, they all became graphic design students. So instead of being like the best artist in the class, I'm like I got to talk into the mic, I'm way down here. And so I always thought of design as like talent. Like you can draw, you got this talent, you can design, you have an eye for it. Some people are just born with it. But what this poster taught me, and part of the reason I was able to like hang with the rest of those super talented people, was that there are principles to this. This isn't just talent, there are skills, and this is something you can learn and apply and put to your work. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to be going over some of these design principles because I think most people that I talk to have a pretty good eye. I bet most of you in this room can look at a design and say, that looks good, I like that. But what I want you to start doing is I want you to be able to look at a design and say, why do I like that? Why is that working? Why is this design not working? Why is it not clicking with me? So whether you're like designing your own t-shirts or whether you're hiring a designer to help you with it, if you get a design in from that designer, you can say, oh, I see what's going on here. Okay, maybe you accent this a little better. So that's the way I want you guys to start thinking about things when you're looking at your designs. So I should probably take a moment and introduce myself. Hello. My name is Brad. Where's Chris? Chris, could I get a glass of water? I totally forgot to do that. So I am a designer, obviously. Most of the work I've done for the last 16 years is web design. technically, if I want to get into titles, I am a UX and a UI designer. It stands for user experience, user interface designer. So most of what I'm doing is designing software, designing websites. So as a freelancer, this is the kind of stuff I did. This is the Green Bay Packers Pro Shop. This was one of the, thank you very much, one of the big projects I worked on last year. I often find myself as being like the token designer or creative director on a project with a bunch of developers who know how to code and do that sort of thing. And so this was fun because I got to go to Green Bay for a couple weeks. We lived in the equivalent of a frat house. I don't know if you are familiar with Lambeau Field, but most stadiums, like here in Seattle, it's in the middle of a city. And in Green Bay, Lambeau Field is in the middle of a housing development. Like, we literally looked out our back window and there's Lambeau Field. It was pretty wild. Yeah, not fans. So I'm a Browns fan, and nobody cares about Browns fans. One. All right. The other kind of stuff I do is I design a lot of apps. This is for an insurance company. This has been an ongoing project for me. There's this little doodad. It plugs into your car, and it's kind of Big Brother-ish because it tracks where you go and kind of teaches you how to be a better driver, and in theory lowers your driving, your insurance rates, or raises them depending on how bad your driving is. But since it is kind of Big Brother-y, they wanted the brand to look nothing like an insurance company. So a lot of the work I did around that wasn't so much, there was a lot of UX and kind of wireframing and figuring out the blueprint for the app, but a lot of it was just kind of creating a friendly brand, using colors, using things that you would never expect from an insurance company app. And then I also love to throw illustration in my work as well. This is an ongoing project that I'm currently working on right now. This is for West Point through their alumni association. It's like an interactive map, so I get to draw all these old buildings, and I get to put little people marching, and I get to draw trees and stuff like that, and I get to, you know, kind of work some of my illustration into some of my graphic design work. So that's like half of my time. And the last couple of years, I spent a lot of time doing the freelance work, like the web design work to pay the bills. But the other half of my income has been coming from passive income sources in recent years, which, you know, Chris talked a little bit about how he met me and through the YouTube channel and stuff like that. But it actually started several years before that. I started drawing comics because I like to draw, and there's a saying in the graphic design world that you get the work that you do. And so I was getting a lot of little websites, and I wanted to get more illustration work. So how do you get more illustration work? You do some illustrations for yourself, you put it out to the world, and you try to get some attention to it, and over time you start to get the clients and the work that you want to do. So I started drawing comics, and what I found is that I started to build an audience, and I really get a high building an audience. I love creating content, and I love doing that stuff. And as the audience grew, other people were like, hey, come and we will pay you to make comics for our website. And if I got really lucky, they'd show up in like books or magazines. One time, like in 2011, one of my comics went totally viral, took down my site, and it was awesome. That's a good story if you ever want to hear it over a beer. But what I've been doing over the last 2 years or so is right here. This is the YouTube channel. Kind of fell backwards into this one as well. I got a drawing tablet, a Surface Pro. I was one of the first artists to review it because most people would scribble on this thing with a pen and go, the pen's great. And I was like, well, how does it react? How's the pressure? Does it blow out in the medium range? You know, I wanted all the geeky answers that you can't get on like CNET or anything. So I reviewed it, and it got a ton of views. Ended up doing really well, and a friend of mine who's really into affiliate marketing said, you're an idiot for not putting ads on this thing. You're an idiot for not putting Amazon links onto this thing. So I threw an Amazon link on that video that had 100,000 views at that point in time, and the next day I had $25 in my Amazon account. And I said, oh. It was 3 weeks before I made another dime. So, but at any rate, that's been growing over the last 2 years, and that's kind of what brings me here today. So let's go back to these design principles right here. They're really easy to remember because you can kind of break it down into a simple acronym. It's just as easy to pronounce as it is to remember.
Put it on a shirt.
Yeah. Hurry up. I got bad news for you. There's an easier acronym out there. Once I got out of school, I found this. This is actually a real acronym. It stands for contrast, alignment. No, I said that out of order. Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And what I found is you can take those 9 design principles that I learned in school, and they really boil down easily into a much easier to pronounce and remember acronym here. So let's talk first about contrast. When I am looking at contrast, like these colors, this red here and this blue, this pink and this blue, they look really different. Unless you're colorblind, because if I smoosh these two colors together and you're colorblind, you're probably not seeing any difference between these colors at all. There's not a lot of contrast. It's easier to see if I put it in an illustration. Right now, this bottle of water is really kind of starting to fade into the background. If I desaturate it, if I suck out all that color, you can see that some of the gray tones are almost identical to each other. I often hear clients say, make it pop. Oftentimes what they mean, they don't maybe know what they mean, but oftentimes what they're trying to think of is make it stand out more. So if I make this a bottle of milk instead, even though this is like a mid-tone color, that crisp white color really stands out on that background. Now if I desaturate that bottle of milk, you can see it really crisply on that background. So I have to say, I've been kind of researching merch. Chris reached out to me about 3 months ago, and I immediately signed up for my merch account, and I am still waiting for my merch account to arrive here, which has led to some interesting conversations, because I've been talking to people here, and they're saying, oh, how long have you been into merch? And I'm like, I'm actually still waiting. And then the follow-up question is, why are you here? But I think this is one of the things that I think a lot of you guys do really well is you understand this idea of contrast. It's a dark shirt, let's put light colors on it. So this is one I pulled off of Amazon that I thought looked really nice. It does it really well. And it ends up using some darker colors as the sprinkles because they're using the lighter color on the donut. Things like that. But there are other kinds of contrast as well. There's shape contrast. This comes in really handy when we're talking about illustrations, which can be kind of strange shapes and how you can kind of use those, aligning those with text to do some neat things. Size contrast. I am going to be talking a lot about size contrast because size contrast can really help your design stand out. When we look at a layout or a design of any kind, the largest thing on that page, we're just going to perceive as the most important element on that page. So size contrast comes in really handy. So this is a shirt. This is not an Amazon shirt. This is one I pulled off a site. And what I like about it is that immediately, this is for a family reunion. Ruckriegel, that's the last name. You know what the most important element on this design is because it's the largest thing on the page, and it has some smaller elements to kind of balance it out, some medium-sized elements. There's a lot of stuff going on here. When we look at this in the context of a layout, like a website page, one, we've got some different contrast going on. The color contrast, because we've taken that color out, that yellow is screaming at us. We can't miss that yellow button or the yellow icon in the upper left-hand corner. But the size contrast is pushed up really big too. This isn't one of those things where they took the headline and they made it a little bit bigger than the text below it. They made it way bigger. They pushed it up much larger. The text underneath much smaller. We can also use subtle contrast, and I think that's something that gets a little underrated when you're thinking about your designs. So in this context, you probably came to this site because you want to download something, and there we have, at the very bottom of the page, we have our download button. But next to it, we have this little donate with PayPal link. Instead of being bright orange, they've made a white button, put like a nice orange, stroke around it. We read that as a secondary action. And subtle contrast can help you do that. It can help you say this is the primary thing and this is the secondary thing you should be looking at. So here's an illustration from a comic called Astro's Polyp. I love comics, so I have a couple comic examples in here. And what I like about this is, one, it feels like the Midwestern town that I grew up in. Everything's flat, there's a water tower, but it's that last panel, there's a factory, just kind of sitting in the background. And usually when we think of a factory, we think of maybe it's belching smoke, or maybe workers are marching off to work. There are a lot of connotations that come to mind when we think of a factory. None of those really come to mind when I look at this illustration. And the reason why is because of contrast, or subtle use of contrast. Because it is almost the same color as the background, it recedes into the background. So when we see it, we're not thinking, oh, this is a story about a factory. We're thinking, oh, this is a story of the sun rising instead. It goes into the background, it means it's not as important, and that's how we visually interpret it. So here's a trick I do on a lot of my layouts. I will color the background like a really light gray or an off-white, and I'll put a white box on top of it. What that lets me do is it says, hey, everything in this sidebar or everything in this box is grouped together. And you don't necessarily notice that, because if you put a drop shadow on it, it would draw too much attention to that white box. If you put a stroke around it, it would draw too much attention to it. A bold color of that box would draw too much attention. But it's just a subtle thing you can do, and subtle contrast comes in really, really handy. Here's a t-shirt, and I think what's kind of cool about this, it's almost hard to see on the projector, but this is the same color gray that they're printing the t-shirt in, but you put it on a lighter color, you can see the flag a little better. You put it on a darker color, you can't really see the flag, but at the same time, that subtle look kind of looks cool. You can actually play with that sort of thing. Next up, we have repetition. I pulled some of these shirts off of Amazon because I didn't think they were bad. I pulled them off because I thought they were designed, but we can kind of push them a little further. And when we're talking about repetition, oftentimes I'm thinking about it in terms of what design elements are repeating. Sometimes we're repeating a color, sometimes we're repeating a font, and I think what happens with a lot of shirts that I see is that even though you kind of get the vibe of what the person was going for when they designed it, there's a lot of fonts going on here. So you kind of have to wonder, am I focusing on pause? Am I focusing on life? You know, that sort of thing kind of brings it into question. Whereas if a shirt is using the same color and same font throughout, every word kind of carries a similar weight to it. The phrase is meant to be read as a whole. You're not supposed to have one word jump out at you. This is kind of easier to explain as a website. So everything on this website, every story repeats. So a story consists of some elements. You got a photo, a headline, and a paragraph. And as I go down the page, I get photo, headline, paragraph, until I get to this. This is totally different. And it stands out because it's different. But what's important is we set up a pattern by repeating that pattern, and then we create visual interest by breaking it. If you haven't set up the pattern first visually, you can't create visual interest by breaking it. So you need that repetition to create the pattern and create the visual interest. So here's a shirt that I threw together. Very basic, you know, the world's greatest beagle. Well, what if I want to call out the word greatest? Well, I can change the color of that. And since it's the same font and it's all the same color, now that blue color is standing out. It looks different than everything else. It's emphasized. I could push it even farther by changing it to a different font. Now it really stands out. So by kind of establishing the baseline, you can create visual interest and draw your eye to one part of the design by doing things like that. Next up, I want to talk about alignment. Alignment, as I was putting this together, isn't quite, it's very strong on the web, it's very strong in a lot of visual design mediums. I don't think it's quite as strong when we get to t-shirt design and stuff like that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So oftentimes we look at something and it looks chaotic. We've got boxes, we've got circles, we've got a staircase going back and forth in the background. Like, how do I read this? Well, it's on a grid, so we kind of can infer how to read it. We start on the left when we're reading something, we move to the right, and so then when we get to the end, we go to the next row, and we can kind of piece that together and figure it out. And most websites, even though they might not look like it at first glance, are actually on a grid. So as I scroll down this website, you can see that more or less everything is lining up pretty well with that grid. So even though this bottom part of the website looks nothing like the top part of the website, it still feels like part of the same cohesive design because of alignments. I have a friend who used to work at Google, and the setting screens on Android used to look like this. And it drove him nuts because there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 alignment lines on this. What designers laugh when I show this. You guys are like, so what, 8 alignment lines? But when he cleaned it up, he knocked it down to 4. And you can really clean up your stuff if you're not indenting and if you start to pay attention to what is aligning with what. So here's, I think, something that kind of works kind of neat when you start getting into alignments is that oftentimes if you have an illustration and you also have some text on a page, sometimes it feels like the text is just floating next to the illustration. How do you tie these things together? Well, what this person did is, where's my laser? It's hard to see, but the word fan and his foot kind of line up. So it almost feels like number 1 fire art fan is sitting on the same piece of ground that his foot is standing on as he's running. Even though you're not drawing the ground, we kind of feel, it feels together. It's aligning these two things together with that kind of line along the bottom. Next up, we have proximity. This is where it gets kind of fun. I like proximity a lot because we tend to visually group things together. When I look at this page, I see 3 chunks. I got an icon, a headline, paragraph. Why do I see one of these as a chunk? Well, that's because there is more space between the chunks than there is between the icon, the headline, and the paragraph below it. So visually, we process it that way. In a t-shirt I threw together here, I was doing something similar. This is a quote. At first, when I started it, I thought it was an Abraham Lincoln quote, but then I did a little research, and it turns out he never said this. So I threw a little maybe at the bottom underneath this attribution. But what I wanted to do is I wanted the quote to be read as one thing. Whatever you are, be a good one. And then I wanted to, it's almost like a period at the end of a sentence. I wanted to add extra space, make you pause for a second, and then say Abraham Lincoln, maybe. So here is that shirt I was working on earlier. I have the world's greatest beagle. And one of the very first things that I noticed was when I started to lay it out and I changed the font, there's a lot of extra space here than there is between this line, and then you have more space. And the reason why is because this G is kind of descending down. And so immediately that bugged me. And I was like, do I choose another font? What do I do? I ended up just moving Beagle up and kind of making the G overlap. And then I had the problem of this little descender on the G, it was overlapping on the B. So what I ended up doing is I masked out a little bit of that B to give me some of that space, to give me some of that breathing room. And this is one of those things where if it overlapped on the B, you'd be like, oh, that looks weird. But if you just knock it out a little bit like that, most people probably wouldn't even notice that it's knocked out. It just looks very natural. Here's a shirt I pulled off of Amazon. I don't know how long it's going to stay on Amazon. But it's a quote from Game of Thrones. And I think what happens a lot is this is probably a free font on the internet that you could go and download. It looks like the title font to Game of Thrones. And so what ends up happening is when you get kind of a homemade font is the spacing gets off. So the first thing I noticed when I got here is this block, what I do, it's jammed together. I want more space between what and more space between I. So whenever you're grabbing a font that is a free font that someone's just thrown up there, oftentimes the first thing that breaks apart is the spacing between letters, the spacing between words. So pay extra attention to that sort of thing. The other thing that's going on here is that he's resizing, he or she is resizing a lot of these elements. And so I'm not really sure, we get some extra, space here. So there's a lot of space here. There's not as much space underneath here. There's extra room over here. So those are things to look at too when you're stacking text on top of each other in this manner. Also, just as a side note, I kind of wanted to point out that oftentimes you're seeing a thumbnail of a t-shirt or you're seeing a t-shirt from afar. And so like when you're walking up to somebody, you got to get really close to them in order for this t-shirt to have an impact. And the thumbnail's kind of the same way. This is a shirt that is not on Amazon, but takes the bottom half of that quote. I think does it pretty well. Obviously, this takes a lot more time to take this and put it into this kind of shape. There's a lot of custom fonts going on here, or actually they're probably hand drawing the fonts. But when I look at it from a distance, even if I can't quite read that middle line, at least I'm seeing a shape. I'm seeing a graphical t-shirt starting to appear here. So that is crap. Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So what I want to do next is I want to kind of go through and critique some stuff out there, critique some shirts I've found, some of the stuff that I've put together, and walk through my design process, because I think a design process is fairly iterative. Oftentimes I'll sketch something out in my notebook, but what I end up with is very different as I start to kind of churn through what I was building. So this is a shirt I found, and part of the reason I picked this is because I thought it's not a bad design, but I think we can kind of push it a little further. So the first thing I was thinking is like, let's critique it. The first thing I noticed is as soon as we move to the lighter gray, we're starting to lose some of that contrast. The big thing is like the word work over here is starting to fade in with the gray of the t-shirt. Some of the gardening tools we're starting to lose a little bit because they're fading in. It works a lot better on that dark shirt. The other thing that I noticed is that all of the elements are about the same size. We tend to view this, and I see this as a block of text, I see garden as a block of text. I see this almost as a block, even though it's kind of different shapes. I see chickens as a block, so it feels like blocks stacked up on top of each other. And so the illustrations are starting to lose their oomph because they're just kind of blending in with the rest of the design. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to redesign this, where do I start? So I thought I'm going to start with the illustrations. So I redrew the illustrations on the shirt, and I thought, okay, so let me go back to the name. I just want to work in my garden and hang out with my chickens. Very specific. And I thought, okay, chances are is if you have chickens, you probably have a garden. But if you have a garden, you probably don't necessarily have chickens. So let's focus on the chicken aspect of this first. So I grabbed the chicken and I made it bigger. And then I wanted to make the other elements smaller. So we're talking about size contrast here. I want the chicken to stand out, so I make it larger. The next piece I want to take a look at is color contrast. The chicken is also lighter than the other elements. The tools are going to show up on the darker color pretty well, but they're not going to jump out to you as much as the chicken because they're just kind of fading back. The contrast isn't as high. That's another thing that the chicken has going for it. So the next piece is I kind of looked in my sketchbook. How did I lay this out? Well, I kind of just threw blocks of text and I centered it. And so I thought, I'm just going to throw it out here. Whatever font I have going on, I'm just going to lay out the text the way I see it. It's a horrible font and it kind of breaks the design a little bit, but I'm starting to understand how this is going to lay out. I really want the word garden to jump out. Like I said earlier, I decided to just push the size of it up. Let's go big, right? Same thing with the word chickens. Let's just make it big. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, time to find a font. And so what's my next slide? Yeah, so I'm going to leave my presentation, and I hope this works. Sweet. Okay. So there are a lot of sites out there where you can download free fonts. There are sites where you can download free artwork. There are sites where you can pay for artwork. There's a couple that I like. This is one of the ones I like best. And the reason I like sites like this is because the licensing is so easy to understand. In theory, I've read some stuff in the Facebook groups where some designers disagree with this, but what a designer does when they upload their stuff to this site is they are agreeing to the licensing rights of design cuts. Yeah, that's which one this is. So no matter what I grab on the site, the licensing is going to be the same. Whereas if you go to Etsy or you go to another site, oftentimes what you'll find is each designer licenses their work in a different way, and that can lead to sticky situations. But Design Cut seems to do pretty well. So what I do is I like to find these deals. I get the emails, and every so often I'll find a font bundle and be like, I need that. So the other reason I like it is they give these great examples of how to use these fonts. So as I scroll down and I look at all these, it came with all these awesome fonts. I'm just going to geek out about fonts here. Futura alone is worth $30. Futura is worth like $200. I don't know what it's doing on this list. I was so excited to get it. But what's cool is you can look at this stuff and you can say, oh, I can see how I'd use that. Okay, that's what they're doing with it. So this is a great way to get some inspiration. This is a better example. So when I take a look at something like this, immediately this font and how they've laid it out and everything, man, this would be a killer t-shirt right here. I mean, I'm not talking about stealing the design, but using this for inspiration and understanding how they're using it. Size contrast, Burton is really big. Color contrast, Burton's going to stand out more on that dark green than the and hand is going to stand out on the lighter color, right? Everything is kind of the two script fonts, 30 layers in the corner. They're using proximity to kind of move those around. So, and they're also using alignments along the side to kind of line these things up. So our design principles apply to all of these things. Anyway, it's got all these great ways to use this same font. So that's why I like Design Cuts, is because they're actually showing you how to use it. And there's several other ones out there, Design Bundles, Creative Market. Designers will upload the same stuff to multiple places. So I scroll further down the page and I get to this. This is Jack and Zoe is the name of this font family. And this is the font. This font screams chicken shirt to me. So I'm going to roll with this one. And again, there's all sorts of great stuff this comes with. It comes with all of these different elements for you. It's showing you, hey, here's how you can use our fonts. Some really cool stuff. So back to the presentation here. So I can open this stuff up in Illustrator, and I can see all these files that they give you for free to kind of work with. And oftentimes what you find is when you pop your font into one of these, or your name into one of these logos, your name will be too long, and then it just won't look quite as well. But it's a great starting point. Here's a close-up of some of those. Here's one I pulled out. And just to kind of talk through these design principles again, Sarah Hudson, that's the main thing we're focusing on. Why? Because it's a darker color. And it's bigger. And then the secondary thing, photography, because it's smaller, it's lowercase, they've made it kind of not stand out quite as much as Sarah Hudson. Also, I'd like to point out that they made the doodly-doos along the side here. Where's my laser? You know what I'm talking about. They made those gray, and I bet the reason that was made gray is because when they first laid it out, if they're black, they kind of look like this. They're kind of fighting for, dominance with the headline Sarah Hudson. So they probably made those gray to kind of fade those in the background and not draw too much attention to it. This was another one of the logos that it came with, and I thought, oh, maybe this is kind of the same thing. Like they made it gold because if you make it black, it starts to kind of pull away from the logo itself. But I think it actually works really well as black too. And the reason why is because you've got some white space around the text. So the text becomes really readable, and there's not a lot of space on those really decorative elements. So that name really stands out. So I dropped my chicken font onto my chicken design, and I'm ready to roll. It's already looking better than the font I was using before. What I've done here is I decided to then start changing the color of the font on top, font underneath. I made it the same orange, so it's not quite as prominent. The other thing, so at this point, this is iteration 3. This is step 3 of my iterative process. And now I'm going to start to pick it apart and go, okay, how can I make it better? Because I think this is really where a lot of designs stop. It's like, looks good, ship it. So what do I see? Well, one, this D is bugging me. This just feels like it's too close. But if I push it up, if I push that text up, then it's too much. I think the reason it's bugging me is because I got this big empty spot right here, and I've got too much space here and not enough space here. So I think that's the piece that's kind of driving me nuts. We're going back to the P of crap, proximity, and how that works. So what I'm going to do is in this next iteration, I'm going to take that block of text and I'm going to resize it a little bit, and I'm just going to sink it into that space. And there is just as much space here as there is down here as there is over here. And so that's a way you can kind of look at proximity and use that as a way to kind of, just set something very nicely into a space. The other thing I have is I took this and didn't center it because nothing made sense being centered anymore. So I thought, well, I'll move that up in here, and I aligned it with the bottom of the chicken. That was my first thought. But then I have something similar going on. I feel like there's less space here than there is below it. So I thought I'd use alignment, but I think proximity kind of takes over. So this is where a lot of those judgment calls and practice comes in as you do it over time. You start to say, okay, I'm going to move that down instead because it just looks off to me. So our design guidelines often start off as ways to help us get to a point, but then at a certain point, sometimes you just have to make a judgment call and kind of tweak or break some of those rules. So looking at this shirt, this would work well on a dark shirt, but it wouldn't. I still don't think it'd work well on a light shirt. If I put it on a medium gray background like that gray shirt, we're totally losing that orange color that text is. Some of the other elements work well. I think we're losing some of the illustration because some of the orange. So maybe I'm iterating. Maybe this becomes a second t-shirt. I have a second t-shirt for different colored shirts, for a lighter colored shirt. So in that case, I'm just going to start recoloring my text, make it more readable. In this case, I chose green. I still thought, even though the green now it becomes readable, I still thought maybe I go white. It's a mid-tone shirt. Ended up making the text orange because obviously the yellow is going to jump out a little bit more at you. Recolored the tools a little bit. So it's just kind of a process. You get it to one point where you like it, and then you tweak it and you tweak it and you tweak it. So this is a shirt I designed. This is a bird lover's shirt. And this is using an illustration. So I want to kind of walk through my thoughts on a lot of the layouts we think about are like text-based layouts. But when we're designing an illustration, it still follows the same rules as everything else. So let's talk about C, contrast. We've got darker colors on a lighter shirt. So we're good for color contrast. Size contrast, just to make this illustration visually interesting, I have like larger birds and I have smaller elements. And so I tried to keep a balance between large and small elements just to kind of provide some variety in the layout. What's next? Repetition. Wait, repetition. So what am I repeating here? Well, I am repeating some of the elements, but I don't think that's what's making it work. What's repeated here that really makes this work is every single thing in this illustration is the same line width. So if I made like some of these thicker and some of these thinner, it still kind of works, but it doesn't look nearly as good because I'm not repeating that line width. It doesn't seem to have the consistency. And I see this a lot. For example, oftentimes you'll get some clip art and you'll get all this stuff and you'll look at it and you'll say, wow, these clouds look great. This will work really well in a design. And then you'll make one really big and you'll make another one small. And now they look inconsistent from each other. So the one on the left, since it's larger, it's got a thicker stroke around it. And the one on the am I facing the right way? Yeah, and the one on the right is, it's got a thinner stroke on it. And so sometimes you have to just kind of go into Photoshop or Illustrator and kind of try to manually change the width of some of these things to make them look more unified. I see this in web design all the time. People will go out and they'll grab an icon over here and an icon over there and an icon over there, and they'll throw all the icons on one website, and then it just looks off, and they can't figure out why. Well, it's because you have 3 icons that don't match each other in some way. So here we are. I was going to say before I went to this slide, I'll say it anyway. Alignment is our next word. I'm not actually using a lot of alignment here. The end of the word bird and the end of the word lover kind of line up with that circle, but that's about it. I'm not really aligning any of the birds on here. That's not my original image. I'm going ahead now. Anyway. So lastly, I want to talk about proximity when we're dealing with this illustration. What I've done in this particular one is I've just moved all the birds around willy-nilly. So instead of keeping, let me go back. So what I've done on here is the distance between all the objects is very similar. And so that kind of gives it a sense of unity. So again, this is where proximity comes into this illustration. So now when I jump ahead to this one, and I lose that proximity, it's still kind of working because the other design principles are at play, but it just doesn't look as clean. It looks a little bit more thrown together because of proximity. So at this point, I was kind of happy with how things were going, but I thought this shirt, I could push it a little further, so I thought maybe I hide the words bird lover inside the shirt. Well, this is an example of repetition at work again. The strokes around the words bird lover are the same width as the strokes around all of the illustrations, and so what happens is we're actually losing the word. But again, we've established that pattern with repetition, so we can jump in there and break that pattern and really draw your eye back to something. So that's kind of my design process. That's how I go over a lot of this stuff and how I like to think through some of these designs. This is the part where I pimp some of my work up here. So I thought it was easier instead of throwing a bunch of links up here to actually just throw you to my website. And if you want to see my YouTube channel where I do a lot of reviews of hardware and I have some tutorials and that stuff, that's up there. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Those are my 2 social networks of choice. Also, I have some links to some Udemy courses. If you're interested in learning GIMP, I have a new course, and I have a free coupon on this website. So if you want to learn GIMP for merch specifically, that's my new course. I have it up there. I have 100 coupons right now, so there should be plenty for everybody in this room. There might be some left over for the folks watching the videos. So have at it, where I talk about using GIMP, which is a free Photoshop-like software to do that sort of thing. Also up there, I have some of my other Udemy tutorials. I have one called Adobe Illustrator for Zombies, where I'm teaching a zombie, a cartoon zombie, how to use Adobe Illustrator. So that's a beginner's course. I tried to make something that was fun because there's a million Illustrator courses out there, so I wanted to stand out. And I have some stuff there as well. And lastly, I wanted to promote one last thing. It is not up yet, but this morning, at 5:21 a.m., I got my email. So this little drawing on the back of everybody's name tag, it says Success in Seattle. If you're interested, eventually, Amazon is going to approve it.
And when they do, hold on a second. There we go. This is a t-shirt design. Yeah. So we're gonna get it up there. Hopefully it'll get approved today. If not, we'll get it in the Facebook group sometime in the future. We'll get it up there, and maybe you can help me tear up. Like literally, I will tear up if I listen to it. Cool. So I've got what, 10 minutes? 15 minutes for questions? Yeah. So any questions? If anybody wants me to critique their designs, I'd love to do that. So yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I've got one, and I think it'll lead to something that's in your tutorial, so I'm not going to go really deep into it. But with that bird lover's design, I noticed you had the big, well, let's put it this way. I can't draw a circle, so I had to put a circle in there and put all that stuff in line. Do you have grid lines inside your circle that you try to plan it in to get all that to sort of look right?
Well, I think I started with like a circle shape, and I kind of made it. I was in Illustrator, and I made the like circle kind of transparent so I could see it in the background, and then I just moved my birds around and resized them as I needed to. Yep.
That's actually kind of what I was asking. But you said that you had a Udemy course for GIMP.
GIMP, yes.
Is that listed on the website, or do I have to go to Udemy?
That's listed on the website.
Okay.
So I actually have it pulled up. I didn't have time to style the website, so it's a plain old HTML. But yeah, got my freebie here, designing great T-shirts in GIMP for merch by Amazon, and then some of my other stuff as well.
Okay. Thank you.
You've got to have questions for Brett. There it is. All right. You're next.
This isn't a question, it's a testimonial. I'm about halfway through the beginner course on Illustrator for Zombies, and it's one of the few Illustrator courses I've ever taken that's actually given me some understanding of the ability to do the things. And he does it with great humor, so I can highly recommend that course.
Cool. Thank you.
You gonna catch?
Oops.
Okay, I use Photoshop and I have the gamut warning so that when I pick colors, they're accurate, right? Because the way I understand it is we design in RGB, but merch prints in CMYK or however that goes.
Right.
So I stay within the gamut warning. So my pink, if I want to pick a beautiful hot pink, it's not going to print that way.
Yep.
Now, on your Udemy course for Procreate, is there a gamut warning for that? If when I'm picking colors on my iPad Pro for the
I don't think there
Procreate?
is.
So what can I do? I mean, would I just put it into Photoshop and change my colors over there?
Yeah, I think that's probably your best bet. Over time, I just kind of learned what colors dull that, and I started as a web designer, so I'm not super picky about colors the way a lot of print designers are. But yeah, I think moving it into something like Photoshop, converting it to CMYK is the best way to kind of see what your colors are going to dull, because what you're going to find is happening, and I found this happening with that shirt I showed earlier, is this morning when I uploaded it to Amazon, the blues were getting lost when I changed it over to CMYK, and the blues of the collar and the blues of the shirt were getting too similar, so I had to go and pump up the contrast so you could actually see that there's a collar to the shirt and stuff like that. So it's a good idea to convert it to CMYK and then fiddle with it.
Ready?
Nice.
Hi, Brad. Oh, dang. So you use mostly Illustrator?
Illustrator and Photoshop, yep.
Okay. So like, how do you get your fonts on Illustrator? And do you find that it's pretty easy to arrange everything?
It's very easy. I have, so as far as just installing fonts, there is one chapter in the GIMP course where I go through, if you're on Windows or a Mac, how to install a font and how to use that. And even though that's not Illustrator, once you have your fonts installed, it's pretty easy to use them in any program. Every so often, you're going to find a font where you install it on your computer, and it doesn't work with Illustrator or it doesn't work with the program of choice. That probably means that the designer was not paying attention to all the details they needed to pay attention to when they uploaded their font. And so sometimes that happens with free fonts. But yeah, if you want to, check out the GIMP course and just go straight to the part where I talk about uploading fonts.
Okay. Okay, so you do like most of your design on Illustrator, and then you then move to GIMP or Photoshop.
I actually, if I design in Illustrator, actually, I'll give you guys a behind the scenes peek. Like I said, I iterate a lot. So when I started this design, I started just playing with stuff. I knew that I kind of wanted this, like I want the Space Needle, I want the mountain, what else am I gonna do? And then I thought maybe I can put it here, which looks good for a title, but I didn't think looked quite as good for a t-shirt, you know? And so then I started playing with colors. I liked the orange at first, but then when I looked at it again, I hated the orange. This was, I don't know if you can see it on the projector, this was the original design right here, and then this morning when I got in there, I went and tweaked the design because those blues were just looking too similar. I don't think I'm answering your question at all. I think I'm just showing off my designs. But in this case, what I would normally do is I have set up this file, or I would go here, I'd go File, New, and I would set up my file. I don't have one set up here, but I'd set up my file to be 18 by 15 or whatever it is, or whatever the pixel dimensions are. I'd create it, and then I just, once it was created, I'd go here, I'd highlight what I need, copy it, paste it to the new file, size it to what I need it to size to, and then export as a PNG from there.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Thanks.
So on the same subject of fonts, what if I wanted to uninstall all the non-commercial usable fonts from my computer? Is that something
That's a
that
good
you would
question.
recommend?
I keep my fonts pretty lean actually because I don't like to just get lost in them. So yeah, from time to time I'll go in there and I'll just, on a Mac it's really easy. I can just highlight it and delete it. So it kind of depends on you. I like to keep it lean and clean because otherwise I spend forever looking through fonts that I don't need anymore. It happens to me a lot because I go to a client site and they have their own brand fonts and they give you those fonts, and then once that project's over, I usually uninstall them after a while.
So is it pretty easy to find out how to uninstall like the default fonts a computer comes with?
Oh, the default fonts?
Yeah, because when I open up GIMP, there's a lot of fonts in there I don't want to use.
Let's find out. This isn't Windows, so I don't know if you're on Windows. I'm cruising for a bruising if I'm going to start deleting random fonts here. But I should be able to just actually come in here, right-click on anything, and just disable it. So I think there's disable and uninstall. And disable will just toggle it off on your computer. At least if you're on a Mac, it's a little different on the PC. So that might be the way to go. Yeah.
Brad, a follow-up question to that. Have you ever heard of somebody getting in trouble for using a font commercially that they were not allowed to? Ever?
No. But
Just saying.
so on the web several years ago, when you use a font on the web, I mean, 10 years ago you could use like 6 fonts on the web. I think it was like Arial, Times New Roman, Georgia, kind of Helvetica. Only Macs had Helvetica. And then they added this line into websites. At the top of your website, you could say load in Futura or whatever font you want. But what it would do is it'd take the font, which fonts used to be really expensive, and like thousands of dollars for a set of fonts. And what it would do is it would put it on your server. So bradcolbow.com, you could go there and like you can save an image from a web browser. You could save a font the same way. And so I think early on, when web designers started doing that, Font Foundry started cracking down on that, and they started sending cease and desists to web designers. But people came up with kind of workarounds, and now there's services you can buy through Adobe, like Typekit, to get that sort of thing. In terms of like print design or print on demand, I've never heard of anybody getting busted for fonts, and most designers share them. Like if I go to a client site, I don't want to pay $600 for a thing of fonts. The client doesn't want me. They just give me the fonts. I use them, and then when I'm done, I uninstall them.
And I'm not a lawyer, neither is Brad, but I would say you guys got to sleep at night with the fonts that you use, like without being afraid. I see a lot of that. People are afraid to use fonts. I don't want you to be afraid to use fonts. I want you to be like, I think I'm doing it right, and then just do your thing, you know. And that's just my opinion. It's not really advice. So.
One thing being in design is with fonts, buy your fonts. What they don't want is sharing fonts. They don't want you having your font package and giving it to a company. I've never seen, in the sign industry, I've never seen somebody get busted for using a font. There are some foundries that put watermarks on their fonts though. They can trace it back to who bought the font, and if it shows up and you've got it, they can come back on the person that bought it. But I'm not scared. I buy my fonts. I'm not scared about putting them on a t-shirt.
Fonts are so cheap now. Like they used to be so expensive, and now they're cheap.
I just have a quick question. It's just because I don't know. If your designer has like license for fonts,
Mm-hmm.
can you just ride that license as well?
Can you ride that
Oh,
license?
sorry. I meant so if they have like rise to a graphic or whatever from Shutterstock or
yeah.
like fonts.
Well, that's a
can you
great
just use that
question.
in their t-shirts? I
I have always said yes because I'm a designer. I buy the stuff on behalf of the client, and then I use it all the time. I don't have the right to then give the, like you were saying, to give that font or that artwork over to the client that I purchased, but I have I purchased the right to use it. So I'm not sure exactly, but that's kind of how everybody does it. So I think the expectation from a legal standpoint is, yes, if the designer bought it, it can be used in that design.
Thank
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, kind of a comment and also a bit of a question. One, I really enjoyed your talk,
Oh, thank you.
and I kind of felt good. I've been a designer like you for 30 years, and so it affirmed some of the few things I've learned in those 30 years. One of the things for folks that may not know, but if you're designing a lot of places want you to output to PNG,
Mm-hmm.
which in and of itself converts your CMYK to sRGB format. So, but also realize that every computer that you look at, every screen you look at is going to look different unless you have that color calibrated with some very expensive equipment. So if your design is very color dependent, and that's really important to you, it's a very good idea to order one of those shirts first before you go mass producing them or really putting them out there. You want to make sure your colors, like you say, are the right. Now, what I wanted to ask was, I'm not yet in merch, and so I really haven't looked at their specs to see what their uploads are, but a lot of places I've come across want you to design initially, of course, in CMYK, so you get your colors a little bit closer to what they're actually going to be, and then when it converts over. Have you found that those conversions are fairly accurate when you end up printing?
Yeah. First of all, great points. As far as that question, so since I've always been a web designer, like you said, every every screen is different, and so I've never put much weight in the colors that I'm doing. I focus more on the contrast between the colors than the colors themselves, because that usually holds up pretty well. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. Color is one of my blind spots as far as like kind of moving between profiles and moving between screens and converting. I know every time RGB tends to be brighter than CMYK. Things tend to dull out. But yeah, I don't know exactly.
Well, also you're looking at two different kinds of systems, RGB being what's subtractive and CMYK being additive colors, so it's a whole different concept in your brain too.
Yeah, yeah.
One last question for Brad. Anybody?
Thank you. So speaking of color, I don't like changing between RGB and C. That's just a pain. So what I do in Photoshop is I look at, say I want red. I will look in the panel for CMYK red and pick that and just trust I'm not color dependent. I want a reddish. If I'm doing a flag, I want it red. I know not to pick RGB because it's not going to turn out well. So is that good enough? I mean, just kind of going with CMYK and just.
I think so. Yeah, and like I said, I personally think contrast is so much more important than color. If you get the color close, you're going to be okay, and there's going to be some color differences no matter what you do. But if you can nail the contrast between the colors that you're using and the contrast between those colors look good, if the red isn't quite as bright or the blue is a little more dull, that's okay because the design itself will still look visually appealing if the contrast is there.
Okay, and one thing about gray, I do a lot of stuff with gray on black. I like the look of gray on black. if you do that, what percent gray do you like on black? Do you go the 40, 50, 85? Do you have
I just kind of
percentage? Or?
Yeah, it depends on what I'm doing, and I just kind of eyeball it. If I'm going for really subtle stuff like on the web, I use like 2% gray. Like I talked about the background color that I throw on a website, I go really light. I go like 1 or 2% gray, almost imperceivable. In fact, I bet a lot of screens will blow that color out, and you won't even see it on like 10, 20% of the screens out there. Because it's not an essential piece of the design. If it is an essential piece of the design, I try to push the contrast up more and more. Since I'm kind of new to the merch and t-shirt world, I'm not sure what that is. On the web, there are specific accessibility guidelines. A lot of sites, especially if you do a larger scale site, there are contrast guidelines for people who are visually impaired, and there's actually tools out there you can use to see, hey, is the contrast on my site too low? Are people going to be able to read the text? Do I need to bump up the size? Do I need to bump up the color of that text? Those are the guidelines I'm used to. And so usually when I launch a site, that's something that we test when we're doing the designs, is we'll upload them to some of these tools out there, and we'll do like a quick contrast check, and it'll say, hey, you got a B on this one, you got a C on this one, you got A's on all these, and then we'll go back to the C's and B's and see if we can bump up that contrast a little bit. But as far as print and as far as t-shirts, it's a little harder to tell. I just kind of eyeball it and try to say, is that readable? Do I like it? It's kind of just a gut feeling.
Guys, give it up for Brad. That's great. Who would like to get a hold of Brad and ask him some questions afterwards? Right? He gave you his contact information. I'm gonna give you a little trick, a little secret. He just put up a link for a free Udemy course that he put out. I'm pretty sure if you like tweeted him, hey, I just took your Udemy course and left a review, and then asked a question, probably much more likely you're gonna be like, oh, I better respond to this guy, just left a review on Udemy. But here's another thing, don't just get the Udemy course for free and leave a review. Actually go through some of the course, because I'm assuming that would hurt it. Udemy be like, what do you mean 100 people took your course? They know no one looked at it and then left a review. That's not good. So if you're gonna leave a review, actually take the course, right? At least go through some of it before you leave a review. But I'm telling people little tricks, say, guilt you a little bit. Be like, hey, I just left you a review, dude. So like, I gave a little first, now can you answer my question about color, right? You helping him out, then he's gonna help you out. It's kind of that easy.
I like it.
Right?